back to Clown Wizard Studios. We are continuing our history on the House Targaryen during the reign of the Targaryen, from Aegon the Conqueror to the Mad King himself. And where we last left off with our previous video was King Daeron was sitting the Iron Throne, although he actually spent more time sitting in his saddle than he did sitting on the Iron Throne itself, because he determined that he would finish where his ancestor, Aegon the Conqueror, had left off, and finally admitting Dorne into the realm. And just a quick recap, the young king ascended to the throne at the age of 14, and unlike previous Targaryen kings, he decided to forego the regency, which would have only lasted 2 years until he turned 16, and took over the king right away and got right to wanting to conquer Dorne. And his advisors, when they told him that there was no more dragons and that the only reason Aegon was able to have the firepower that he did is because he had dragons, he famously said, they told him he had no dragons, that you're looking at one. And henceforth he was known as Daeron the Young Dragon. So he went over his plans with Aemon Velaryon, who is the legitimized bastard, rumored to be the son of Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake. Making the adjustments to the invasion plans of Aegon the Conqueror, they decided to split the army into three, 2 by land and 1 by sea. His initial campaign was a smashing success, and over 40 Dornish lords bent the knee at the submission of Sunspear. One of the knights who fought in this war was Aemon Targaryen, who is also known as the Dragon Knight. And the Dragon Knight actually thwarted an assassination attempt on Daeron by throwing himself in front of a poisoned arrow. And if the name Dragon Knight seems familiar, it's because he has been brought up multiple times within the Song of Ice and Fire books. I haven't really heard any debates about this or really read anything, although I'm sure there are plenty of threads on Reddit for such debate. But in terms of the greatest knights who ever lived in Westeros, Aemon Targaryen would arguably be at the very top of that list. He was known for his sword fighting abilities, and also for his valiant nature. He's actually favored among the singers in Westeros. There's a lot of songs that sing his praise. And I believe he's also Bran's favorite knight to hear stories about from Old Man. But Dragon Knight was a contemporary of Daeron Targaryen during the Conquest of Dorne, so that's when he lived. And he actually ended up captured. Daeron returned to King's Landing with hostages after the submission of Sunspear so that Dorne wouldn't rebel. He left Dorne in the hands of Lord Tyrell of Highgarden, and he was actually killed in what was known as a bed of scorpions. Bed of scorpions was where the rope that you'd pull to summon a servant, I think it's called a servant bell, instead of ringing a bell, it actually pulled down 100 scorpions, which stung him to death in his own bed. For this reason and other reasons, with regards to the history between the Reach and Dorne, which do share a border, for Dorne that would be on the northwest border of Dorne, and for for the Reach it would be the southeast border. But there have been Dornish raiders that have pillaged the towns and the outer reaches of the Reach for centuries. And there's actually a chapter in Feast for Crows with point of view character is Aerys Oakheart, and he is one of the members of the Kingsguard, and he's actually a member of the Kingsguard throughout the from the very start of the series, but he doesn't become a POV character until A Feast for Crows. And Aerys Oakheart is from the Oakheart family, which is from the Reach, and I forget off the top of my head where Oakheart is, where their keep is, but it's an old family. I believe it's descended from Garth Greenhand, and he does talk about in his thoughts, he thinks about how much animosity there is between Dorne and the Reach. He even thinks about the Dornish silks that he's wearing. If his father had seen him, he said he would be spinning in his grave. And he also mentioned that because people know that he's not only that he's not Dornish, but he's someone from the Reach, he said a lot of people would spit in his drinks, and that was not uncommon. And so I know that the Lord Tyrell assassination with the Bed of Scorpions pretty much inflamed that animosity between the Reach and Dorne. And so that's when that happened, was during the Conquest of Dorne, with Daeron, the young knight, as king. And although the lords of Dorne had hostages in King's Landing, it was actually the small folk of Dorne who rebelled. Daeron was called back to war as the occupiers of Dorne had trouble stamping them out. And Daeron was finally killed in Dorne, with 3 of the Kingsguard slain. And at this time, this is when the Dragon Knight was captured. Before dying, I believe it was after he returned to King's Landing after the first conquest. After the submission of Sunspear, he wrote a book called The Conquest of Dorne, and that is referenced multiple times in the World of Ice and Fire book and throughout the series. That's actually a pretty popular book, and it's regarded to be a book of elegant simplicity. And I believe it is in that book that's where Daeron comes up with there's 3 types of Dornishmen. And he said there's the sandy, the salty, and the stony. And that pretty much is indicating the 3 different, not regions, but landscapes that Dornish find themselves in. The stony are the ones who live in the mountains, and I believe this includes House Dane, House... Dondarrion, that's the Stormlands. I know House Dane lives up in the mountains. Fowler, I believe, because their sigil is a falcon, a hooded falcon. The Sandy, which would include Uller, which I know their holding is in Hellholt, which is in the middle of the desert, and then the Salty, which are located along the coast, and that includes the one I know for sure is Martell would be considered the salty one, salty Dornishman. But it was during the conquest that he came up with these terms, and wrote about it in the Conquest of Dorne. So once Daeron died, his brother Baelor the Blessed took over, and there's a quote, I think it's Tyrion, said about Targaryens that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin and the world holds its breath. And that pretty much means the Targaryen will be very capable, as in the case of Aemon Targaryen, the Dragon Knight, as in Aemon Targaryen, the Maester at the Night's Watch, who's been around for over 100 years, as in Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who ruled ably for 64 years. And then there's the extra crazy ones, including Maegor the Cruel, the Mad King Aerys II, and in the case of Baelor the Blessed, he is one of the extra crazy Targaryen kings, for Baelor was by far the most devout of all of them, and he actually worshipped the Seven, which at this point was more uncommon for a Targaryen. And after Darren's death, he pardoned the Dornish hostages on King's Landing and forgave his brother's killers. And rather than finishing his brother's conquest, he sought peace with Dorne. And to do so, he ended up walking barefoot from King's Landing to Sunspear. He stopped in Will, W-Y-L is the name of the keep, to ask for the release of the Dragon Knight, who was locked in a small cage, naked and exposed, for which they refused. So with that, with that, Baelor took leave and continued on to Sunspear, and he agreed to marry his nephew Darren, who was the son of Viserys II, to Miria Martell when they were of age. And he also requested that the Dragon Knight be released as well, to which the Prince of Dorne agreed. And Baelor chose to walk back to King's Landing and made another stop in, I think it's Wyle, W-Y-L. This time, a pit had been dug beneath Aemon, and it was filled with vipers. They agreed to release him and gave Baelor the key, who then walked through the viper pit, insisting that his virtuous nature would protect him from harm. And although the singers claimed that the vipers bowed in his presence and let him pass, the truth is he was actually bitten multiple times. When he finally reached the cage, he handed Aemon the key, who ended up having to unlock the cage himself, and pulled Baelor up on his shoulders, climbed on top of the cage, and with his I believe they're nephews, his nephew on his shoulder, and him naked, having been sitting exposed in the sun for a while, leapt to safety over the viper pit. It's one of the more daring acts of valor that's mentioned in the Westeros history. Although I think by far the most remarkable story of valor would probably have to go to Barristan and Selmy and the rescue of King Aerys II from Duskendale. But that's a story that doesn't take place for over 100 years from this point, so we'll leave it for that time when we get to it. So, Baelor was the Dragon Knight was rescued from Wyle, and in the process, Baelor was bitten multiple times by vipers, and he ended up going into a coma. He was brought to Blackhaven, the seat of House Dondarrion, to care for him until he was a little better, and then later he was treated further at Storm's End, which is a little closer to King's Landing. He was married, but he never consummated his marriage. In fact, there's a quote by Jaime Lannister that said that Baelor the Blessed was a king who was afraid of his own cock. And that's one of my favorite quotes definitely one of my favorite Jaime Lannister quotes. The other Jaime Lannister quote that I really like is, he was talking about the prowess of his mentor, the leader of the Kingsguard, Gerald Hightower, who is known as the White Bull. And he also mentioned Arthur Dayne, who was another knight of the Kingsguard when he started. And he was another knight of high renown, who wielded an ancient ancestral sword called Dawn. And any member of the Dayne family that wielded it, it was called the Sword of the Morning. And Jaime described Arthur Dayne as someone who could fight off. What do you say? He could fight off the three of you with one hand while holding his cock to take a piss in the other, something like that. But that kind of gave you an idea. It was a very colorful, wonderful description, opinion of somebody within Game of Thrones universe about somebody else that we never met, but also kind of really tells us, who Arthur Dayne was, as far as like swordplay goes. So Baelor the Blessed never consummated his marriage, and he later confined his 3 sisters into what's called the Maiden Vault. And this was comfortable, but they were basically locked away from the rest of the world. And some say he did it because he was afraid of their beauty, but he also wanted to keep them away from the wickedness of King's Landing and the world at large. Again, Baelor was extra crazy. He also outlawed prostitution in King's Landing and ordered the brothels closed and threw the whores out of the city. This was a very unpopular decision amongst the people of King's Landing, but he was deaf to their protests and wouldn't relent. He also ordered a sept to be built on Visenya's Hill, which he had seen in a vision, but it would not be completed until after his death. The sept that he ordered built was the site of the Walk of Penance that takes place towards the end of the series. I won't say who has to take the walk, just for spoiler purposes. This is also where there's an execution that takes place early in the series, and it's actually on the steps of the Sept of Baelor where it takes place. Baelor also ordered the books of Testimony of Mushroom and Unnatural History to be burned due to their content. Earlier videos I did mention both of those books. Testimony of Mushroom was the body raucous autobiography of the court fool Mushroom, who was the court fool from Viserys the First to Aegon the Third, and he was part of the court of Rhaenyra Targaryen during the Dance of the Dragons. And his book Testimony of Mushroom, while unreliable as far as historical accuracy goes, it is referred to multiple times because he was the only one in the room who wrote about certain events after they took place. And so, while it's inaccurate, it is also an important book, and that was burned. I think there's a lot of like stories about sex in there. I think that's why Baelor had it burned. I think that's also why it's really popular. And then Unnatural History was written by Septon Barth, who was the best friend and hand of the king to King Jaehaerys the Conciliator. And this book was a book about dragons, and he had theories about how they came to exist. And he said it was I believe it was like Shadowbinders or Blood Mages in the Shadowlands, which is as far east as you can get in the world from Westeros. That's where the Shadowlands exist. And he said it was them working magic on wyverns. And wyverns are natural animals that exist in the Game of Thrones universe. But wyverns don't breathe fire, and that's where they differ from dragons. Other people dispute this theory that this is where dragons come from, saying that there were always dragons that could breathe fire as long as there were wyverns. So, and why this was burned by Baelor the Blessed, I'm not quite sure. I just know it was due to the content. Another thing that Baelor really loved to do was fast to the point of fainting. Baelor had named an illiterate half-wit who went by the name of Pate to the position of High Septon, and he was only in that position for a year until he died. And it's rumored that his uncle Viserys, who would become Viserys II, had poisoned him. After that, Baelor had then raised an 8-year-old street urchin to the position, claiming the boy was a miracle worker. Again, I would say Baelor is probably the most harmless of the crazy Targaryens, clearly his craziness is all aimed with the intention of doing good and providing for people, but, you know, the craziness is clearly there. And Baelor himself died of starvation due to his extended fasting, which he did intending to purge himself of his lusts. Others claim that his uncle Viserys poisoned him because he had a plan to convert everyone in the realm to the faith. The faith is very strong in the south of Westeros, specifically in the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach, Stormlands as well. But the two areas where it didn't really take hold is pretty much all of the north. The Andals, that's what I was trying to think of. The Andals didn't make it north, so they didn't and the Andals were the ones that were spreading the faith around. Whatever the book of the faith is called. It's like the 7 crystals or something like that. I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank. But it was the north, and I believe Dorne did not were the two biggest areas where the faith hadn't taken hold. But Baelor wanted to convert everyone in the realm, and some people are going to take issue with that. So there was rumors that Viserys had him poisoned. The Ironborn, that's the other region that would not have gone over well because they still worship the drowned god. And so, Baelor died from fasting, supposedly, although rumored to have died from being poisoned. And so the king that followed Baelor to the throne was Viserys II. And Viserys was the son of Rhaenyra Targaryen and the brother of Aegon III, who was King Aegon the Dragonsbane, Aegon the Unlucky, the Broken King. That one, so Viserys II was his brother, and he was the uncle of Daeron and Baelor. Viserys II had actually fought during the Dance of the Dragons, and people thought that he had died during the battle, during a battle, but he was actually in Lys. His brother Aegon assumed that he was dead, and when he returned to Westeros, he was delighted to discover that he was alive. He became the Hand of the King during the last years of Aegon's reign, and then also during the reign of his nephews, Daeron and Baelor. So Viserys II was very much like Tywin Lannister, who wielded an incredible amount of power, acted, as the Hand of the King, so he understood the office and kind of understood the responsibilities of the king. But he did not last as king himself for very long. Lasted a little over a year, and the couple things he was able to do in that time was establishing a new royal mint and updating the codified laws that Jaehaerys the Conciliator had written. But he was a pretty shrewd king during his reign, and I think he was probably fair, but he was definitely stern, I would say is a better word. And the rumors about him poisoning his own kin definitely don't paint him in a great light, but that is what it is. I believe I've said in a previous video I'm actually doing this as a voiceover. I tried doing it where I recorded the coloring first and then put in the voiceover second, so I'm just kind of seeing how that goes. I kind of miss actually talking about being in the moment and talking about the process. So I think the next video is going to kind of go back to that form and see how that goes. But that will be it for the Scarlet portion, and we'll continue the history lesson of the Targaryen kings when we color the black background. And that's going to complete the Scarlet portion of House Targaryen. On to black.